sort his hair and it didn't go well. All of that good stuff is kind of common stories at Whyte and Mackay. So Shackleton, as in the blend, which I encourage everyone to stick in the freezer for 5 minutes, is a way for us to bring more people into the category. The whiskey that we sent to Antarctica, I mean, if I was to tell this whole story with 50 words on the back of a Shackleton carton, I would run out of space, right? But it is easily the biggest brand we have. It's in terms of what people know about it. I get asked to PR it every week. I get an inquiry from a writer. I had one last week from South Africa, just saying, hi, can you tell me a little bit about this? And can I love it. Like, it's my favorite brand, but I don't have favorites. So Shackleton is designed to bring more people in, which is why it primarily lives in big box retailers. And we won't be doing McKinley's for the foreseeable, but that's Shackleton, and that's Invergordon. So Invergordon is the home of our science. It's also the home of our warehousing. I'm going to finish my story at Invergordon when Greg comes in, because that's where we spend most of our time together. It's also home to our single grain distillery, Invergordon. And on the 21st of July, mark it in your calendars. Soren, you're welcome to grab us back on, and I'll try and grab my Irish colleague Shane, and we can do this again and just talk about Invergordon. But that's the 21st July, and that is one of our 5 distilleries.
Yeah, no, she'll certainly do that, even if it's only me and you two.
Right, you have 4 options. Where should we go next?
I think we can maybe go to Dalmore, because I think that's probably the big name that everybody does know.
Good. So Dalmore, Invergordon is about 30 minutes from the Dalmore, but they are miles and miles and miles apart. So the Dalmore is tucked just below the road. You wouldn't know it was there, except as you get close to it, everyone's named their house the Dalmore. It's kind of a giveaway. So as the closer you get to it, you see more stags on people's houses. They were almost all people that at some point and another have worked with the Dalmore. So it's just tucked down on the river, and it's sufficiently upriver, so it's miles away from the cruise traffic. It is miles away from the mechanical element of Invergordon, and it's just peaceful. It is an amazing place to be. It's the last big event Richard and I did together was at the Dalmore. So on the 30th of November in 2019, wow, time has gone, hasn't it? Mm-hmm. And what have we done apart from learn how not to cut hair and just be a little bit bigger than we were before? Time has gone. So we reopened the Dalmore distillery in November 2019. That sounds wrong, but maybe it's right. And it was Richard and I and 6 close friends of the business. And that was as far as we got before things started to overtake us, because it's at that point that the Wuhan situation really came through. And we had to start to really question what were we doing. The Dalmore is a significant brand in Asia and in China in particular. So by this point, we as a business are already dealing with COVID. We reopened. It is a tiny, tiny distillery. There are beautiful cathedral distilleries within that part of the category at that price point, but we don't have the space because we are between the road and the river. We'll go one way and we'll get run over. We go the other way and we will get wet. So the Dalmore is very, very small, very boutique, very quiet. We don't get the opportunity to host a lot of people there, but in the 15th of May, I think it is, we'll be having an online whiskey festival with our friends at Glenmorangie for the Highland Whiskey Festival that week. So put that in your diaries, that's happening. The Dalmore, 1839. The Matthesons, the Mackenzies, the Pattersons, a great chain of whiskey makers going all the way through. There's a gap in our history when we had to allow the Americans to come and use our very long pier, the Yankee Pier, with access into the deep water I talked about with Invergordon, so it's still very deep at this point. So there was a part of our history when we were doing that. And there's a part of our history when really the Dalmore was very, very different. So I'm going to lift the computer again and we'll have a look. I need to put my mask on. So this is the Dalmore set of history of bottles that are in our office that you would see if you were with us. So you can see this is a very old bottle. Can you see that? Yeah.
Yeah.
This is a very old bottle. slightly newer bottles, 79, 81, 78. As we go further and further forward, you start to see things like the Aurora, which was one of the record breakers. You can see an older Dalmore King Alexander. And if you look just up here, this 50-year-old Dalmore is in a ceramic bottle. And the secondary market value for that is astronomical at the moment, all the way through. I'll come on to those in a minute. So the Dalmore has had the same kind of, I guess, evolution over time as Whyte and Mackay blends, but for different reasons. So the Dalmore has always been different. The Dalmore is a brand we believe that we can evidence when we were first taking whiskey from out of the distillery, the new make whiskey, and putting it in one cask, then another, then another, then another, to experiment to see what the effect was on the whiskey in the cask as it matured in these beautiful warehouses right next to the river. And I won't talk about terroir today, and we're not in that territory, but you will hear me talk about the, thank you, Andy. You will hear me talk about the place a lot. So we do believe that by being next to the water, the moisture levels are different. There's a microclimate at the Dalmore. It can be snowing in Dingwall, and as you come down into the Dalmore, no snow at all. So it is a different place. So we've been doing a lot with casks. So we worked for a long time with Gonzales Bias, who are one of the quite distracting, that, isn't it? But thank you for the interaction. We've been working with Gonzales Bias. So Antonio, who is the master blender of Gonzales Bias, similar generation to Richard, have been working together for a long time, and they've given us access to casks that we wouldn't necessarily have available. But we talk about that a lot, and actually that's not all we do. We don't just do sherry. So I have got in my glass today, I just wanted to kind of show you the darkness of a 30-year-old Graham's Port. So Graham's Port House Graham's isn't someone we talk as much about, but actually we should. And we're going to be talking about it a lot more. So Graham's are, now correct me if I'm wrong, if anyone knows, but I believe actually they were Glaswegians that went out and founded Graham's. But in any case, they're another source of our casks that we take, and they come to the riverside location in Cromarty Firth, sit at the Dalmore, and they mature our whiskey. So that's not just ports, that is a 30-year-old Graham's Port. It's a significantly punchy liquid. So if you want to understand how the Dalmore character comes around, have a drink around with a really beautiful Oloroso sherry from Gonzales Bias, or have a really beautiful port from Graham. So that's just, there is a lot on the nose. That's absolutely outstanding. Now I couldn't drink this on its own. It's not to my taste. I'm a whiskey guy. I grew up in Jura and I've grown into other things, but the flavour and the punch from these secondary liquids is really important. So when we think about the cask that we're buying, we're doing two things. And I'm gonna share another child-related story with you now, if that's all right. But the last time Greg and I were together in the real world outside of Glasgow, which does very much feel like the Truman Show to me at the moment. Like I feel like I'm not sure that Glasgow is real. I'm not sure that you're real, frankly. I don't know if any of this is real, but Glasgow, no. Yeah, it's not. None of it's real.
No.
You're telling me you're at home, sir, and I have no idea. It could just be a fake backdrop. We were up in the Dingwall area. So Dingwall is the town nearest to Dalmore, and we were up putting our hands onto trees in the snow. So we have been since 2016. Remind me, Gary, in a second. I'll come back to you. We have been since 2016 much more interested in local sourcing and the circular economy. So we've been very interested in how do we work with these great landowners that are on our doorstep to bring them more into the fold. We've also been mindful that as the whiskey industry has exploded, the sherry industry isn't enjoying the popularity it used to. So there's a huge demand on casks. There's only ever more competition for wine casks, port casks, sherry casks, even the ex-bourbon situation. It's becoming much more of it's a secondary market all on its own. But there are people in financial roles that just earn a living by trading casks between the States and Scotland. You know, that's a whole mini industry on its own. So we've been really interested through pragmatic reasons, but also because of something I'll come on to talk about, in sourcing casks from much closer to where they're built. So we're up a mountain, putting our hands on trees, and then the snow descended. It was at that point that I remembered I had my partner and my kids at the house, and we had to drive home. And it's quite a long drive down from Dingwall to Glasgow. And for anyone that has small children, if there is an emergency bathroom situation, it's quite stressful. So if you're in big wind in Scotland and a lot of snow, and there's a sudden call of, I need the toilet, that's quite a lot to deal with on the A9, frankly. So we pulled over eventually, because we got halfway back down the road, pulled over on the thing, on the hard shoulder. And yeah, not yellow snow yet, Thee, because then what happened is this person, who I won't name because, you know, this has been recorded, suddenly says, too cold to go. So I'm there with my daughter, too cold to go. Like minus numbers, snow, dark, terrible. Anyway, this is one of, Greg says I have to tell everyone this story because this is the last one we were together. Eventually, a big articulated truck went past, covered us both with snow. We laughed, the situation relieved itself, and then we got back in the car and drove home. That's the last time we were up the road. So there's a lot, and when I talk about casks, I'm not talking about a clinical buy the cask, put the whiskey in it, leave it in the house. There's a lot of hands-on cask selection that goes on. So if you look at the colour of the port again, what we're buying isn't a seasoned cask, as in, so you could season a cask, you could buy a cask from Graham's or from Gazaiah's Bias, put this liquid into that cask for a period of time, and we would call that seasoning, and then take it out or leave it with a little bit of liquid in it and then use it that way. So we're not talking about that. We're buying the actual cask that Graham's are using. And so we like to think of them as that being drenched in this port or drenched in this Gazaiah's Bias. And you hear Greg and Richard talk about that a lot in terms of the type of wood that we get. So by the time that the Dalmore New Make Spirit is going into them, the pores of the wood are absolutely open and have had that influence from the port over, in this case, 30 years. So where does this go? Well, this goes into the Portwood Reserve. So Portwood Reserve is one of our entry-level stews. Its ABV is a little bit higher than the usual Dalmores, and it packs an absolute punch. But if you have a Portwood Reserve in your house and you can afford to get a Graham's from Amazon, this was actually an offer when I bought it. It's tiny. I'm not huge. It's a tiny little bottle, isn't it? It's only that big. That's quite expensive. But if you taste this alongside a Dalmore Portwood Reserve, you get a real sense of the history of what that has gone on over its maturation period. Other things on the Dalmore. So why make life easy? Why put something in the cask once when you could do a Richard Patterson and put it into 5 casks? So you then end up with the probably the thing that we're most well known for is the King Alexander. And I'm not going to bore you with the history story, although it is true. King Alexander is so named because that is a part of our history. Colin of Kintail saved the king. The king said to Colin, nice name, we will give you the right to bear the royal stag on your family coat of arms forever. And here is some land, the land which is where we have the Dalmore today. And so that's why the stag is on the bottle of the Dalmore. It comes from Colin of Kintail, and that's why King Alexander III is called King Alexander III. It's named after King Alexander III of Scotland. So with the Portwood Reserve, you're talking about a finish with 30-year-old tawny port pipes. With King Alexander III, we take that liquid and we split it into 5 different things. And I haven't got it to hand, and I haven't committed it to memory. But it goes 5 ways, and then we bring that all back. So 50% of that liquid goes into American X-White Oak bourbon, and the others goes into 5 wine, Marsala, Oloroso, and it's not in my head right now, but come back to me. And that's King Alexander. So it takes the notion of finishing in, hi Jojo, takes the notion of finishing in casks and really adds that complexity. The reason that's important is we think that's fundamental to how we get to flavour, and flavour is fundamental to why we do any of these things. Excuse me. So when we talk about Shackleton, or McKinley's, or Whyte and Mackay, or even Whyte and Mackay Light, that's all about flavour. So the one thing that unites Greg and Richard when they finally get to working together in 2016 with Margaret, with Shane, with all of the other people I mentioned, is absolutely flavour. So if you can, a Graham's 30 with a Portwood Reserve, an Oloroso sherry with a King Alexander, it just deconstructs that flavour and gives you a sense of the journey that whiskey has gone on in its maturation period with us. So we do talk a lot about casks at Whyte and Mackay, probably more than our friends, but it's because we believe it gives better flavour, and it's about having the investment in the actual wood at the front of the process to make it last. Now, I think Gary asked a question about single casks, but I can't remember what you asked, Gary.
I think he was alluring to the fact of some people obviously put a couple of bourbon casks maybe into an Oloroso butt and still class it as a single cask. So he was wondering what your thoughts are now. He says now that finishing cask means you can no longer call it a single cask if it's two gone into one.
No, it's even if it's one into one, sorry. My understanding now is that if you take a bourbon cask and change that into any other finishing cask, you can now no longer call that a single cask. I mean, within our company, I think we've started to call them exclusive casks, where the understanding being it's got to have been in that one cask for its entire life to be called a single cask, which I personally disagree with. But yeah, just know with obviously like Kieran said, the cask finishing history through a lot of the brands, and his thoughts on that.
I mean, I think we try to not be tricksy, and I'm not saying that anyone that is doing it that way is being tricksy, but we wouldn't do that. So when we talk about a single cask for the distillery exclusive, we bottled for mental health last year. So this was on Jura. We genuinely went and found, I think it was 2 casks actually, but they were genuinely 2 casks that had the same life over a period of time. We wouldn't be moving the liquid around. I mean, I think the other thing is Greg versus Richard. So Richard would commit to the rules. He would be, he's probably had a hand in creating that rule at some point within the history of the industry, whereas Greg is the person that's probably going to start pushing those definitions and giving a wee bit more flexibility. I think what's really interesting is when you think about the typical 5 stages of whiskey production that get trained, say, by the WSET, and in reality, the 22 steps that I think probably exist that are not 5, then there's plenty of room to experiment all the way along that if you're doing it with a purpose in mind. So we would definitely be the type of people that would be as close to the rules as we possibly could without breaking our membership of the SWA. I think what you're talking about is a little bit more about the agility, the entrepreneurialism that's needed to make these things work. And I think at the end of the day, as much as whiskey is a craft, it's also a business. It's one of the UK's most important exports, I would say. And thank God Liz Truss was able to announce that we've got a 4-month pause on tariffs, because that was beginning to become a real risk to our industry. But I think the entrepreneurial spirit shouldn't be frowned upon. If you're moving liquid around just to get yourself a little bit more out at the end of the day and it's helping you make more money for what you're doing, that's great. If you're doing it just for yourself and how it tastes, have at it. As long as more people are drinking it and more people are enjoying it, we would be fully supportive of that. But you would find if you ask Richard the question, you would get a certain frown and quite a strict response.
I mean, just jumping on that, do you think it makes a difference with whether it's classed as a single cask or not, if it's a 6-month finish or whether it's a 2-3-year-old second maturation? Then in theory, there's a slight difference between those two.
Only dependent on the wood, right? So it depends on how that wood's been. It depends on your wood management process, whether or not you're going to get any real influence at all. If the wood is spent, bear with me.
Yeah.
I have some staves to my right, but they're a bit far away.
Yep, it's okay. No, I mean, I'll bring Gary back in there. I mean, my argument to that would be if you've put 2 casks into a sherry butt, for argument's sake, and left it for 2-3 years to mature again, then in theory, it's a maturation in that single cask rather than a finish.
Yeah, that's true. And I suppose that is the other side to that coin, is that where there is no definition between a finish and a second maturation.
Yeah.
I think even within individual there's no kind of set. But I personally would probably say anything over 12 months stops being a finish.
Yeah.
That then becomes a second maturation. But like I said, that's one of the few things that is still open to personal interpretation, never mind even at a company level.
Yeah. So we'll bring Kieran back in. I think he's back.
The other word that you see creeping into marketing copy is finesse. Finessed in. And I think, I mean, as much as I enjoy the publicist aspect of the job, it's not really cricket, is it, to play with language in that way? I think it does come down to, it also comes down to finest outcasts.
Yeah.
Sure, I've said that.
Yeah, as long as you're hand picking them as well, Kieran, that's fine.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, not these hands all of the time, but often Greg's. So, I mean, just for anyone that's, I don't want to patronise anyone, so I hope I'm not, but these are the staves that we used. We did an interview with some food researchers for the BBC last week, so these are left in here, but you can see this is a light toasted stave, which is slightly dark, and you can see how close the pores are. And what we're also doing now is investigating what happens when you treat the wood in different ways. So at Invergordon, we have a cask experimentation program, which will take casks, not necessarily the extremely rare ones I've talked about for the Dalmore, but we are also experimenting with toasting levels. And so you can see this is a toasted cask. This is a medium to high toast to see what the effect is on the pores. And Greg can talk about more about this in a short while. To see what the effect then is on how much influence the liquid can take from the wood. But clearly it's a huge difference. And when you just put them side by side, it helps you understand, I think, what we're talking about. I've just got quite a lot of that over the computer, so hopefully it'll be okay. Okay, so in terms of the Dalmore, have a think if there are any questions you want to ask, because I'm just about getting to the end of what I was going to say about the Dalmore. But the King Alexander, you've got Portwood Reserve, entry level skew, King Alexander, which is more advanced, comes at a premium price point, but because it's going on this 6 split maturation journey to take that liquid out, have the influence from the various casks, and then bring that back together as the King Alexander. And it isn't, you know, it isn't an age statement because we don't believe we need it. It is something that genuinely tastes quite distinct. It's got that essence of chocolate orange that you get with the Dalmore, but it's also much more rich and luxurious, and it's an absolute, it is a treat. It is, in my opinion, it's not a nightly supper. I'll come on to Jura in a minute, but it's definitely a treat, and it's quite an indulgent drink. And what you find is that that then begins, that then unlocks the higher end of the range, which is your 30s, your 35s, and some other things that we're about to come down the line with in due course. But there's definitely a bridge in and around about this King Alexander skew, which is definitely the one that most people recognise as being the lead skew for the Dalmore. Any questions on the Dalmore?
I mean, if there isn't any pressing ones, we'll do the question and answers all in a separate section, if that's all right, Kieran, or do you need a bit of a break?
I was giving myself a break, but I've had it now. That's okay. All right, so that's Invergordon, our grain distillery. Dalmore, much older, much more part of the history of Scotch, really. And Richard Patterson is still leading on whiskey making for the Dalmore today. So whereas he's not leading on the day-to-day whiskey making for most of our distilleries, that's very much what he's still involved with. So you'll see more come from Richard down the line on that. But let's talk about Greg. So,
just, I mean, is Greg due on soon?